This 1861 photo of two black Union recruits looks triumphant until you see the note on the drum. At first glance, it is everything you would expect from a wartime portrait. Two young men in crisp uniforms standing tall beside a regimental drum and a flag caught mid-ripple by the photographer's fan. Their chins are lifted, their hands rest with purpose. The image seems to say, "We are here. We are ready. We belong." But one small detail would eventually unravel a story of systematic theft, broken promises, and betrayal dressed up as patriotism. Miriam Hollins noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She had been working as a collections specialist at a regional history museum outside Boston for nearly 11 years. In that time, she had handled thousands of Civil War photographs, tintypes, carte de visite, and cabinet cards. Most of them depicted the same scenes: officers with swords, enlisted men with rigid postures, families posing before fathers shipped off to Virginia or Tennessee. After a while, even the faces started to blur. But this one stopped her. The photograph had arrived as part of a larger donation from an estate in Concord. The family, descendants of a minor Union officer, had cleaned out a farmhouse after the last surviving heir passed away at 93. Most of the collection was unremarkable: daguerreotypes of unsmiling relatives, a few letters with water damage, a medal in a velvet case, and then, tucked between two sheets of wax paper in a cedar box, this image. Miriam set it under her work lamp and leaned close. The two recruits were young, probably no older than 19 or 20. Their uniforms were new, not yet faded by sun or stained by mud. One man held the edge of the flag with his left hand, while the other rested his palm on the rim of the drum. Behind them, a painted backdrop showed a vague landscape, probably meant to suggest a battlefield or camp, a standard studio setup for the era. But something about the drum caught her eye. She adjusted her magnifying loupe and looked again. There, just inside the open top of the drum, a small rectangle of paper had been tacked to the interior wall. It was almost invisible in the shadows, easy to dismiss as a manufacturing label or a scrap of packing material. But when Miriam tilted the photograph toward the light, she could just make out faint handwriting. She reached for her scanner. The high-resolution image confirmed what she had suspected. The paper was not a label. It was a receipt, and the numbers written on it did not match anything she expected. The amount listed was $12. Miriam knew from years of research that the standard enlistment bounty for Union soldiers in Massachusetts during 1861 ranged from $100 to $300, depending on the town, the regiment, and the recruiting office. $12 was not a bounty, it was an insult. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written two names: Josiah Broome and Samuel Aiken. Below that, a date, November 1861. And below that, a single word that made her stomach tighten: paid. Miriam had seen a lot in her career. She had handled photographs of enslaved people posed as servants beside their owners. She had cataloged images of black children dressed in matching outfits with white children, staged to look like playmates when the reality was far darker. She had learned to read the silences in old photographs, the details that the original photographers never meant for anyone to question. But this one felt different. The two men in the image were not enslaved. They were soldiers. They had enlisted voluntarily at a time when black men were just beginning to be accepted into the Union Army. They had put on uniforms and stood for a portrait that was meant to mark their transformation from civilians to defenders of the Republic. Everything about the composition said pride, readiness, hope. And yet someone had pinned a receipt inside that drum. Someone had wanted a record of what these men had actually received. Miriam spent the rest of the afternoon pulling reference books from her shelves. She cross-checked the names against regimental rosters, pension files, and census records. She found Josiah Broome listed as a private in a Massachusetts regiment mustered in late 1861, one of the earliest black units organized in the state. Samuel Aiken appeared in the same roster, recruited from the same town, enlisted on the same day. Both men had survived the war. Both had applied for pensions in the 1880s. Both applications had been denied. The reasons listed were bureaucratic: missing paperwork, unverified service records, discrepancies in enlistment dates. But when Miriam looked closer, she noticed something else. Both applications mentioned disputes over back pay. Both men had claimed, decades after the war ended, that they had never received the full bounty promised to them at enlistment. She sat back in her chair and stared at the photograph. $12. If Josiah Broome and Samuel Aiken had been white, they would have received 10 times that amount, maybe more. The bounty system was designed to incentivize enlistment, to compensate men for the risk they were about to take. It was supposed to be equal. But someone had decided these two men were worth less. Miriam's first call was to a historian at a university archive in Cambridge. Dr. Leonard Pace had spent 20 years studying black military service during the Civil War. He had written extensively about the pay disparities that plagued the United States colored troops, the regiments of black soldiers organized under federal authority starting in 1863. But the photograph Miriam described predated those regiments by nearly 2 years. 1861 is early, Dr. Pace said when she described the image. Very early. Most histories say black enlistment didn't really begin until after the Emancipation Proclamation. But there were exceptions. Small. Units, volunteer companies, men who showed up at recruiting offices and refused to leave until someone signed them up. These two men were in a Massachusetts regiment, Miriam said. I found them in a roster. Then they were probably part of one of the informal units that existed before federal authorization. Some states experimented with black enlistment before Washington gave the official order. Massachusetts was one of them. What about bounties? Dr. Pace was quiet for a moment. That's where it gets complicated. The bounty system was chaotic, even for white soldiers. Towns competed with each other. Brokers took cuts, officers skimmed, but for black recruits, the exploitation was worse. There are cases in the records where black men were promised the same bounty as white soldiers, only to receive a fraction of it, sometimes nothing at all. Who kept the rest? Usually the recruiting officers, sometimes the town officials, sometimes both. They counted on the fact that black soldiers had no legal standing to complain. If a man couldn't read the enlistment papers, he couldn't prove what he'd been promised. And even if he could read, who was going to believe him over a white officer? Miriam looked at the photograph again. Josiah Broome's hand rested on the drum. His fingers were inches from the receipt pinned inside. Why would someone put the receipt in the drum? She asked. Evidence, Dr. Pace said. Maybe one of the men wanted a record. Maybe the photographer helped them hide it, or maybe someone else put it there later as a kind of testimony. Either way, it survived. That's the important part. Over the following weeks, Miriam dug deeper. She requested copies of enlistment contracts from the Massachusetts State Archives. She searched digitized newspapers for mentions of the recruiting office that had signed up Josiah Broome and Samuel Aiken. She tracked down pension applications, military service records, and town meeting minutes from the fall of 1861. The picture that emerged was damning. The recruiting office in question had been run by a man named Lieutenant Charles Eustace Halloran. According to contemporary accounts, Halloran was a minor officer with a reputation for efficiency. He had been tasked with raising a company of soldiers quickly, and he had succeeded. What the accounts did not mention was how he had done it. Miriam found the first hint in a letter preserved at a local historical society. It was written by a white enlisted man named Thomas Oakes, who had served alongside the black recruits in Halloran's company. Oakes described the chaos of those early months, the long marches, the bad food, the confusion over orders. But one passage stood out. The colored men among us are brave and willing, Oakes wrote, but they have been cheated from the start. Lieutenant Halloran promised them the same bounty as any man, yet I have seen with my own eyes the receipts he gives them. $10, $12, never more. He pockets the difference and laughs about it in his tent. I do not know if God will forgive him, but I cannot. Miriam tracked down Halloran's service record. He had been promoted twice during the war, eventually reaching the rank of captain. After the war ended, he returned to Massachusetts and served as a tax assessor in a small town outside Springfield. He died in 1901. His obituary described him as a faithful servant of the Union cause. There was no mention of the missing bounties. Dr. Pace connected Miriam with another expert, a legal historian named Professor Adeline Mbeki at a law school in Connecticut. Professor Mbeki specialized in the intersection of military law and racial discrimination during the 19th century. When Miriam shared her findings, the professor was unsurprised but not unmoved. "What you're describing is not an isolated incident," Professor Mbeki said. "It's part of a pattern. Black soldiers were systematically underpaid, undercompensated, and underprotected by the very government they risked their lives for." The famous case is the pay disparity in the United States colored troops. Black soldiers were paid $10 a month, while white soldiers received $13. And $3 of that 10 was deducted for clothing, which wasn't deducted for white soldiers. So in practice, black soldiers took home $7 a month for the same work, the same danger, the same sacrifice. "But this is earlier," Miriam said, "before the USCT existed." "Exactly. Which means there was even less oversight. No Federal Bureau tracking payments, no standardized contracts, just local officers making promises they had no intention of keeping. Men like Halloran could skim bounties, falsify records, and face no consequences. The soldiers had no recourse. They couldn't sue. They couldn't vote. In many cases, they couldn't even read the papers they were asked to sign." What about after the war? The pension system was supposed to correct some of these injustices, but it was administered by clerks who were often sympathetic to the old order. Applications from black veterans were denied at much higher rates than applications from white veterans. The reasons given were always technical: missing documents, inconsistent testimony. But the effect was the same. Men who had served and bled were left with nothing. Miriam thought about the two names on the back of the photograph: Josiah Broome, Samuel Aiken. Both denied pensions, both claiming unpaid bounties. Is there any way to know how much they were actually owed? Professor Mbeki sighed. Probably not with certainty, but if you can find the recruitment records for Halloran's company, you might be able to compare what white soldiers received versus what black soldiers received. If there's a consistent gap, that's your smoking gun. It took Miriam another month to find the records. They were buried in a collection that had been misfiled decades earlier, sitting in a storage facility that the museum shared with a regional historical society. The box was labeled Miscellaneous Military Correspondence, 1860-1865. Inside, wrapped in brittle paper, were the original enlistment contracts for Halloran's company. Miriam spread them across her work table and began to read. The pattern was unmistakable. White soldiers had been promised bounties ranging from $150 to $200. Their contracts were detailed, specifying payment schedules, clothing allowances, and terms of service. Most of them had been paid in full, according to receipts stapled to the back of each contract. Black soldiers had been promised the same amounts. Their contracts used identical language, identical formatting. But the receipts told a different story. $10 here, $15 there. One man had received $8 and a pair of boots. Halloran had signed every contract personally. Miriam photographed the documents and sent them to Dr. Pace and Professor Mbeki. The response was immediate. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Pace wrote. "I've seen scattered evidence of bounty fraud before, but never a complete set of contracts like this. You can trace the theft dollar by dollar." Professor Mbeki was more cautious. "You'll need to contextualize this carefully. The bounty system was corrupt across the board. White soldiers were cheated too, just not as systematically. The argument you're making is about disparity, not just fraud. You need to show that black soldiers were targeted specifically." Miriam looked at the contracts again. The white soldiers had received their promised bounties. The black soldiers had not. The difference was not random. It was policy. She brought her findings to the museum's director, a man named Harold Wentworth, who had run the institution for nearly 2 decades. Wentworth was a careful administrator, well liked by donors and board members. He listened to Miriam's presentation with his hands folded on his desk. "This is compelling research," he said when she finished, "but I'm not sure what you're proposing we do with it." "I want to build an exhibition around it," Miriam said. "The photograph, the contracts, the letters. We can tell the story of these two men and what was done to them. We can show visitors how exploitation was woven into moments that were supposed to be triumphant." Wentworth shifted in his chair. "That's a strong narrative, but it's also controversial. The Halloran family still has ties to this region. His descendants have donated to this museum. That doesn't change what he did. No, it doesn't, but it changes how we present it. We have relationships to consider, funding cycles, board approval. Miriam felt her patience thinning. These men were robbed. They served, they sacrificed, and they were cheated out of money they were legally owed. Then they were denied pensions based on discrepancies that Halloran himself created. This isn't interpretation, it's documentation. Wentworth was quiet for a long moment. Let me take it to the board. I'll present your findings and see what they say. The board meeting took place 2 weeks later. Miriam was not invited to attend, but she heard about it afterward from a sympathetic colleague. The discussion had been heated. Several members had expressed concern about politicizing the museum's collections. One member, a retired banker whose family had lived in the region for generations, had questioned whether the documents were authentic. He kept asking if there was another explanation, Miriam's colleague said, like maybe the black soldiers had agreed to lower bounties voluntarily, or maybe the receipts were forged later. Forged by whom? For what purpose? Her colleague shrugged. He didn't say. I think he just didn't want it to be true. In the end, the board voted to delay any exhibition until further research could be conducted. They appointed a subcommittee to review the materials and make recommendations. The subcommittee included the retired banker. Miriam did not wait for the subcommittee. She reached out to a journalist at a regional magazine who had written about Civil War history before. His name was David Chen, and he was immediately interested. Over the course of several interviews, Miriam walked him through everything: the photograph, the hidden receipt, the contracts, the pension denials, the board's reluctance. David's article was published 6 weeks later. It included high-resolution images of the photograph and the contracts, along with quotes from Dr. Pace and Professor Mbeki. The headline read, "The $12 Soldiers, How Massachusetts Cheated Its Black Recruits." The response was immediate. Within days, the article had been picked up by national outlets. Historians weighed in. Descendants of black Civil War veterans shared their own family stories of unpaid bounties and denied pensions. A genealogist in Ohio discovered that she was related to Samuel Aiken. She had never known he had served. The museum's board held an emergency meeting. This time, Miriam was invited. She walked into the conference room to find 12 people seated around a long table. Wentworth sat at the head, looking tired. The retired banker was absent. "We've reconsidered our position," Wentworth said. "Given the public interest, we believe it's appropriate to move forward with an exhibition. But we want to do it carefully. We want to involve descendants. We want to provide context. And we want to make clear that this is about a specific officer's misconduct, not an indictment of the entire Union cause." Miriam nodded. It was not everything she had hoped for, but it was a start. The exhibition opened the following spring. The photograph of Josiah Broome and Samuel Aiken was displayed in a specially designed case, lit from above to highlight the receipt inside the drum. Beside it, a panel explained the bounty system, the pay disparities, and the legal obstacles that prevented black veterans from seeking redress. The contracts were displayed in a separate room, arranged chronologically. Visitors could trace the pattern themselves, comparing what white soldiers received to what black soldiers received. A timeline showed how the fraud had persisted throughout the war, even as Halloran was promoted and praised. Descendants of both men attended the opening. The genealogist from Ohio flew in with her 2 children. She stood in front of the photograph for a long time, studying the face of her ancestor. "He looks so young," she said. "He looks like he believes in something." "He did," Miriam said. "He believed he was going to be treated fairly. That's what makes it so hard." The exhibition also included a section on resistance. Dr. Pace had discovered evidence that some black soldiers in Halloran's company had refused to accept their bounties until the discrepancy was addressed. They had staged informal protests, declining to sign receipts, demanding meetings with superior officers. Most of these protests had been ignored or suppressed, but a few soldiers had managed to smuggle letters to sympathetic newspapers describing what was being done to them. One of those letters, written by a man named Private George Bell, was displayed under glass. "They tell us we are free," Bell wrote, "but they pay us like we are still slaves. They tell us we are soldiers, but they treat us like we are beggars. I did not take up arms to be cheated. I took up arms to be a man. Private Bell had died at the Battle of Fort Wagner in 1863. He was 22 years old. After the exhibition opened, Miriam received a letter. It was from a woman in Springfield who identified herself as a descendant of Charles Eustace Halloran. She had seen the newspaper coverage and read David Chen's article. She wanted Miriam to know that her family had always suspected something was wrong. My grandmother used to say that great-great-grandfather Halloran came back from the war a changed man, the woman wrote. He never talked about his service. He never displayed his medals. When he died, they found a box of papers in his study that he had ordered to be burned. My grandmother's mother, his daughter, refused to burn them. She said she wanted to know what he was hiding. The papers had been lost in a fire decades earlier. But the woman remembered one thing her grandmother had told her. She said there were receipts, dozens of them, all with small amounts, all signed by colored soldiers. She said her mother looked at them once and started to cry. Miriam wrote back, thanking the woman for sharing. She did not know what else to say. The exhibition ran for 18 months. It drew visitors from across the country and was featured in several academic journals. A documentary filmmaker optioned the story for a short film. A high school teacher in Georgia built a unit around the photograph, using it to teach students about the gap between the promise of emancipation and the reality of continued exploitation. But what stayed with Miriam was something simpler. Near the end of the exhibition's run, she was walking through the gallery when she noticed a young man standing in front of the photograph. He was in his early 20s, wearing a hoodie and jeans, staring at the image with an intensity that made her pause. She waited until he turned to leave, then approached him. "What did you think?" He looked at her for a moment, then back at the photograph. "I never knew," he said. "I never knew they were cheated like that. I learned about black soldiers in school, but it was always about how brave they were, how they proved themselves. Nobody ever told me they got robbed while they were proving themselves." "A lot of people don't know?" "Yeah," he shook his head slowly. "It's like the picture looks so proud. They look like they won something. But they didn't, did they? They got cheated from the start." Miriam nodded. "They did. But they also left a record. That receipt inside the drum, someone put it there on purpose. Someone wanted us to find it." The young man looked at the photograph one more time. "I hope we keep finding them," he said. "Old photographs are not neutral. They are arguments made in light and silver, shaped by the people who paid for them, posed for them, preserved them. When we look at a Civil War portrait, we often see what the photographer wanted us to see: dignity, courage, sacrifice. We do not see the receipt pinned inside the drum. We do not see the contract that promised $200 and delivered 12. We do not see the pension application stamped denied 40 years later. But the evidence survives if we know where to look. Josiah Broome and Samuel Aiken were two of thousands of black men who enlisted to fight for a nation that had never treated them as citizens. They wore the uniform. They stood for the portrait. They believed, at least for a moment, that their service would be honored. It wasn't. They were cheated by the officer who recruited them, ignored by the government that employed them, and forgotten by the histories that celebrated their sacrifice. For more than a century, that photograph sat in a cedar box, its secret hidden in plain sight. Now it hangs in a museum, and visitors can see the $12 receipt for themselves. But for every photograph like this one, there are hundreds more that have never been examined. Family albums filled with smiling ancestors, textbook images of loyal servants and faithful retainers, portraits of black children posed beside white children, their hands held just a little too tightly, their expressions just a little too still. Every one of those images has a story behind it, and every one of those stories has been waiting, sometimes for 100 years, for someone to look closely enough to see what was hidden. Josiah Broome's hand rests on the rim of the drum. His fingers are inches from the receipt. He is still waiting for someone to read it.